energy issues. And I think in principle that we have two kind of things that we do. So on the one hand, we do research, a series of research projects. And on that note, I think I should welcome probably Sean Thompson, who will be kind of joining this team doing a PhD on the oil industry in not too long. But the other thing that we do is to kind of look across what people are already doing in energy across NTNU and to showcase kind of the diversity and perspectives that we can bring to this field. And today, I think we have a very nice talk. We have Arthur Mason, who is smiling. He's from the anthropology department. And he will be presenting or talking about a chapter from a forthcoming book that he can introduce himself. And to comment on that, we have Professor Emeritus Michael Jones. Really nice to have you here as well, one of the founding figures of the geography department at NTNU. So I think this should be really interesting. So I will mute myself now and just give the digital floor to you, Arthur.
Thank you. So I already have the host. I can share it then, right? I'm going to share some slides. Well, thank you, everybody. This is really, really helpful for me to be able to share, and privileged to share some work I'm doing. Originally, I was going to talk a little bit about the book that this chapter is from, but I've decided that it would be too vague in general. So I'm just going to jump into this chapter, and afterward we can sort of talk about it if there's time. I'm going to go ahead and just let's see here, and I'm going to read excerpts from it, just sort of pulled. Let's see here. From different parts of it. Let's see if I can get this going here. Okay. All right then. So let me begin with the title. Empathy for the graph reflects an absurdist idea. Now, typically on display in the graph is a rationalist confidence in abstract indicators to generate forms of validation that correspond to the real. By contrast, empathy for the graph suggests that this confidence is misplaced, producing a kind of excess that reflects the unruliness of the emotional world. Empathy is a quality of identification with the emotional life of another, and in this context, a process of feeling into aesthetic production. A sculpture, a painting, a musical composition, all may evoke feelings of empathetic engagement. Hence, my talk is concerned with the accomplishments of the graph, not as an abstract indicator, but as a visual that comes alive in the form of aesthetic judgment. Graphing is a technique of inscription that dates back thousands of years, as evidenced by the petroglyph. Apparently, cultural anthropology has a tradition of commenting on the style classifications of graphics. An early example is UC Berkeley professor Robert Heiser's 1947 article on rock etchings in southern Alaska. For this talk, I want to draw your attention to the work of historian Robert Brain. In his 2015 book, The Pulse of Modernism, Brain describes how the invention of graphical inscription instruments in the 19th century opened new ways for moving from materiality to semiotics. Brain notes that engineer James Watt introduced the first graphic copying process to mechanically trace the movement of a piston. Using pencil and paper, the indicator diagram created a two-dimensional visual of displacements proportional to volumes created by the piston. Now, according to Brain, such images shifted the primary determinant of visual representation away from earlier ideas of balance and toward an obsession with the passage of time. The result was a form of thinking in which the graph became a marker for linear temporality. He writes, The new graphical recording instruments implemented in myriad concrete measures the primacy of linear time in a new cosmos of irreversible forces, conversions, history, progress, energy, and eventually entropy associated with the steam-powered world. In nearly every science, thermodynamics, astronomy, political economy, evolutionary biology, linear temporality became the critical variable. Thus, the graph is an aesthetic form exercising power over ways that temporality can be known, what Michel Foucault calls a knowledge-power relation. In addition to linear temporality, Brain draws attention to the graph's poetic function by its extension of power from the cognitive realm to the affective realm. First, the graph involves intellectual calculation associated with interpreting scale of coordinates, timeframes, and ruptures that reenact the event inscribed. Second, the graph requires sensual intuition associated with the rising or falling line, rhythm or direction, and repetition. In this way, the graph amplifies both cognition and emotion in what Brain calls a double reading. Now, jumping ahead to our digital world of information visualizations, Heather Hauser also draws attention to the graph's double reading. Hauser suggests that skillful presentations of complicated data sets on the internet can bring viewers to the point of infogasm through an allure of imagery that promises knowledge. For Jennifer Graby, the allure is intensified through what she calls dispersed material infrastructures. Here, she refers to the speed of internet exchange and the transfer of signals and light that is bound up in imagining the graph. And this kind of material performativity creates an illusion of immateriality so that the graph appears free from the chemicals, metal, and plastics of its visual requirements. So in these ways, the graph is a player in what Arjuna Padarai calls the globalized mediascape. The important point here is the graph mediates between direct experience and imagined worlds. Padarai writes, the lines between realistic and fictional landscapes are blurred so that the further away audiences are from direct experience, the more likely they are to construct imagined worlds, which are aesthetic. So in this chapter, I introduce the graph not by reference to its informational content, but by its poetic function as a visual style classification. And I argue that the graph, despite its content of meaning, is an abstract image analogous to the modern art image. The modern art image is a visual whose recognition reflects the consecration of an effort. In this way, the allure of the graph introduces a new type of perception whose widespread appreciation marks the imposition of a new kind of refinement. Now, the idea of a shared perspective in both contemporary art and energy graphs first came to my attention when I happened to pass through the mezzanine floor en route to an energy roundtable inside the Corinthia Hotel in St. Petersburg, Russia. Executives attending the Russian oil conference repeatedly walked past a set of hotel paintings whose color schemes and shapes seemed remarkably similar to the images of oil development being shown in an adjacent room. In one instance, the straight line features of an oil painting mirrored the block-shaped figures of a bar graph used to depict petrogeologic futures in the Arctic. Now, placed side by side, the graph and art painting seemingly collude in a form of representation whose resemblance gives no indication to which is a primary reference. In a second painting from the hotel, a color palette of yellow and red creates an experience of seeing in, a color contrast between the particular and state of affairs, which is a common feature in artwork. This painting mirrored an oil development image whose yellow-red color contrast also gave the feeling of seeing in on directional ice flows in the oil-rich region of the Barents Sea. Thus, what appeared to me initially as a set of images created to ensure reliability in energy planning soon came to suggest a form of ensuring sociality through a lifestyle of semantic provisioning. That is, faced repeatedly with oil graphs whose resemblance to abstract paintings seemed made to order, and vice versa, I began to wonder if a veracity for planning was instead a preference for the aesthetics of abstraction. In this instance, the graph is a type of visual whose primary resemblance is an art image, the latter a representation whose recognition reflects a stress for achievement.
Arthur,
yeah.
Can I just cut in? There's a discussion in the chat. There is some audio issues.
Oh, really?
And And the issue is that we're not hearing everything you're saying. And there is a suggestion that you might have something on your side called automatic volume settings in the audio settings of your computer. It's kind of jumping up and down, and we lose you at times. Well,
oh, really? Let's see.
So if you go into the audio settings of Zoom, there is one option, automatically adjust microphone volume, and then below that there's also suppress background noise, which might also interfere here. So if that is set to low.
Okay, so audio. Let's see. And where is that? Where would that be?
That's in the left corner where you have the microphone. Where you can
audio settings. Okay, I see it. And all right, so and automatically adjust microphone, suppress background noise. So I have that on auto. Should I put it on something else?
Well, the question is, does it get worse with low or with high?
Can you hear me now? Is that better? Is that at all better?
Well, the thing is, if you speak loud enough, then the filter doesn't kick in. But as soon as you move your head away from the microphone, it kicks in.
I see. Okay. All right. So I'll just sort of, so you can hear me now, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I'll try to do this a little sort of should I start over? Did you guys hear anything?
We heard most of it, so you just fade out from time to time. So just continue.
All right. Okay, so let's see if this can sort of work here. So let's see. So I showed you some incidental observations, and these actually have been taken up more rigorously by Robert Brain, who I mentioned earlier. And he describes artworks whose visual classification is modeled from scientific experiments. So in one example, he points to the artist Edward Munch's The Scream. And in this renowned image, a waveform flowing from the perspectival back of the painting converges on the humanoid figure, drawing the viewer into the painting's landscape and soundscape. And in doing so, the image deliberately sets the conditions of its meanings to resemble an experiment in psychophysiological aesthetics to which Munch was working at the time. So now at this point, I want to return to the second part of the title, Visual Representation Without Resemblance. And as I noted, the graph is a representation that shares resemblance to the contemporary art image. It seems worthwhile then to explore the definition of representation. So drawing on Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance and also Aristotle's notion of proportion, Michel Foucault defines representation as a form of resemblance in three ways. First, representation is the work of resemblance whereby an initial idea is transferred to a new idea by reference to a model. Second, various traits underlay this model, for example, substitution. And third, by presupposing a primary reference, representation affirms an original and creates hierarchies of less faithful copies struck from it. Now, in contrast to this definition, the graph suggests a peculiar type of representation in visual form. It authenticates a primary reference, typically the future. It provokes aesthetic judgment through an image classification that embraces abstraction. And it sets something before the eyes that otherwise remains illusory. The graph, therefore, raises a number of questions. First, since its primary reference is literally the future, how does the graph affirm an original that does not yet exist? Second, as I noted, the graph replicates styles of modern art whose anti-realism ruptures the picture plane. In this way, the graph is alien to the informational purpose motivating resemblance. Consider the image of the oil rig. By comparison, the graph simply lacks any generic relatedness that points to the idea of a family resemblance, to which the logical status of resemblance can be linked. How then does the graph participate in the transference of an idea? And finally, the future itself is an abstraction, while the graph a sensorial image. It would seem, therefore, that resemblance moves from the abstract to the concrete, with the graph resembling an abstract idea it illustrates. And this raises the question of what traits underlay the model of resemblance. So, at this point, I thought what's probably good for this talk is just to put the entire argument into layman's terms. And until recently, our daily lives were populated by two image classifications. The first image are self-evident with classical notions of resemblance, and the second, text. Now, these two image classes make up our lives. By contrast, abstractions are so disruptive that they are typically sequestered and appear in completely different environments. The most common location for abstractions is the museum. Here, people just sit around and stare at images that don't make a whole lot of sense on the surface of things. And this prolonged delay includes specific physical distances, but also the opportunity to investigate in close proximity, the ability to reproduce images for reflection. It includes collective interpretation and individual contemplation. And these practices of delay that accompany interpretation make up what I call the material infrastructure of abstract visual classification. And the only other location where this material infrastructure is evident is in the university, among the sciences. Here, you find the same practices, people sitting around discussing images that don't make a whole lot of sense on the surface of things. Now, it's not a coincidence that in these two locations, the sciences and the arts, you find a monopoly over the legitimate production and interpretation of abstract images. So at this point, I want to introduce a style classification that I borrow from Pierre Bourdieu, who refers to these abstractions as the Kantian aesthetic. And drawing on Immanuel Kant's critique of judgment, Bourdieu puts forth a model of aesthetic judgment whereby abstract graphs versus self-evident imagery are two opposing elements that distinguish taste in Western society. According to Bourdieu, the uncertain imagery of the graph falls under a Kantian aesthetic. The Kantian aesthetic requires a foregoing of immediate pleasure associated with the sensual and self-evident. By contrast, Bourdieu coins the phrase anti-Kantian to describe realist forms of appreciation. Anti-Kantian imagery rejects the esoteric in favor of self-evident representation. For Bourdieu, the anti-Kantian aesthetic acknowledges a preference for popular culture with the aim of immediate pleasure and regard for sensual and obvious. So basically, the problem that I pose to you now is that at some point along the way, the sequestered and rarefied Kantian graph was introduced into our anti-Kantian everyday world of self-evident imagery and text. What is this disruptive image doing here? How did it get here? Who is responsible for introducing it into our daily lives? And what is it doing to us? So in the chapter, I outline a historical change in visualization from the anti-Kantian self-evident to the Kantian graph. And this shift takes place through popularization of scientific imagery and graphs associated with economic cost-benefit analysis. It comes about through a unique staging of verification whereby the Kantian image holds integrity and thus authenticity as a standalone image. The aim of doing so is a stress on long-term temporality and uncertainty. The main agents are environmental activists during the 1990s when they turned to scientific imagery to create awareness about environmental crisis, and economists who in the 1980s introduced neoliberal restructuring of markets. And finally, importantly for this section of the talk, a shift toward the Kantian graph imposes a consecration of effort to recognize images that were never intended to be interpreted immediately. Basically, the graph has been torn out of its material infrastructure of delay and imposed upon mass populations who encounter this abstraction through time frames of interpretation that favor self-evident imagery. And there's no better example of this historical shift from the anti-Kantian self-evident to the Kantian graph than the popular reception of the movie An Inconvenient Truth. In this environmental activist film, imagery no longer relies solely on an anti-Kantian aesthetic to create a sense of urgency for saving the planet. In the movie's most dramatic scene, former Vice President Al Gore traces 650,000 years of greenhouse gas levels and temperature variation in a visualization derived from paleoclimatologist Lonnie Thompson's research. Dramatizing the expression off the charts, Gore climbs into a cherry picker that carries him up a giant screen to trace the staggering projections for CO2 and temperature increase over the next 50 years. According to Heather Hauser, such abstract visuals, including climatologist Michael Mann's controversial hockey stick graph, have visually shaped current environmental debate. And that is, empathy for the planet is now based on a graph, an image that substitutes classical notions of resemblance with an abstraction. And not incidentally, Gore's initial presentation of climate change utilizes the anti-Kantian perspective through photographic comparisons of glacial melt over a 100-year time span. In the movie, this diptych imagery presents climate change in the form of a family resemblance. Glacial melt appears through a comparison of two photographs whose perspectives, though nearly taken 100 years apart, nevertheless replicate the same position, angle, and elevation. After displaying these realistic resemblances, Gore then introduces the abstract graph to show timelines measured in thousands of years. But while the graph aims to represent, its work of resemblance lacks a primary visual reference. The absence of any external reference to which the graph is said to resemble is what I call visual representation without resemblance. This shift from deriving empathy for environmental crisis from seeing a realistic rendering to having empathy for environmental crisis from seeing a graph is what I call a transfer of the anti-Kantian to Kantian aesthetic. The photo image and the graph are two types of images. Appreciation of environmental crisis from these images requires two separate ways of seeing things. In the former, empathy involves classical notions of resemblance, whereas in the latter, the underlying trait of resemblance lies in transposition, or epiphora in Aristotle's sense of the term, where assimilation occurs between alien ideas. In this sense, the photo image and the graph are two separate types of classifying knowledge, two separate ways for distinguishing what is good, and in Bourdieu's terms, what is in good taste. Remarkably, a unique feature of the graph is its resemblance to itself, making self-referentiality into a classical notion of representation. In this image, the CO2 and temperature timelines are nearly identical, suggesting a representational character in the classical sense of Foucault's definition. One timeline is the original, and the other timeline is a model that presupposes an original whose resemblance is a less faithful copy struck from it. Apparently, as with modern art, classical representation in the graph is highly self-referential. I want to end with one of the better examples of anti-Kantian representation in climate change, a painting titled Manifest Destiny by artist Alexis Rockman, who depicts the New York City waterfront 3,000 years from now. As demonstrated in this panorama, Rockman believes that by year 5021, the effects of global warming will have left Manhattan soaking in 82 feet of water, the color of orange Pico tea. Now I'm quoting from a New York Times article. The painting represents a history of the future folded into the contemporary through a multi-layered architectural plan of the waterfront's projected future, and Rockman calls his work history paintings of the future. His vision is a collaboration with scientists working at Goddard Institute for Space Science at Columbia University, which studies global climate change. Rockman states, "I wanted the painting to be as scientifically accurate as possible. The projected results of Industrial Revolution 3,000 years into the future confronts the public with a visual display of repercussions of current trends. If global warming is to truly command attention of politicians, its images will need to infiltrate popular culture." So in conclusion, the Kantian graph marks a refinement of perception. As such, it draws attention to a growing unease among those who rely on images that this refinement seeks to replace. After all, climate change receives no protest when viewed through the anti-Kantian aesthetic, that is, as special effects in the form of a Hollywood movie. The Kantian graph, by contrast, is a move toward refinement and an enforcement of a visual communication whose mode of perception seems to suggest a new style of manners. That is, empathy for the graph is an acquired taste, but it has also become immediately identifiable, not for its content of meaning, but for what it says to the viewer as an arbiter of his or her own sense of taste. Thank you.
Thanks a lot. And then we should join in virtual applause for the talk by Arthur. And we will have time to discuss this, but first I then want to invite Professor Michael Jones, who has prepared some comments to this talk. So please, Michael, go ahead.
Okay, well, first of all, thanks very much, Arthur, for a very interesting presentation and a lot of depth that you cover here. I've read your chapter and I've prepared 4 questions which relate to the written text. Some of these questions are multiple questions. But initially, I'd like to say that I have a lot of sympathy with critiques of various types of visual representation, in this case, graphs, criticizing whether they show what they purport to show, how they're used and perceived, and whose interests they further. In 1991, the geographer Marc Monmonier wrote a book, How to Lie with Maps. And to some extent, I felt that your chapter was telling us or giving us instruction in how graphs can, in a sense, lie. You provide a useful critique of the misuses of graphs in the oil and climate change debates. However, when I read the chapter, it appeared as a critique of graphs as presentations in general. And this comes out too in your presentation now. But the arguments, or rather the evidence, the graphs that you show, are graphs that purport to show the future on an apparently scientific basis, showing future situations that in their nature do not yet exist. So my first question is your critique of graphs aimed at graphs in general, or only at certain ways in which graphs are used, particularly when they're used to show future situations? So is this a specific critique of a particular set of graphs, or a general critique of all graphic representations?
Okay, so I'll just address each one. So in the chapter, I thought I made pretty explicit that that there's a particular point in time in the 1970s when there's a crisis among elites in both Western Europe and North America, in which the elites are, especially, for example, in Limits, the book by Meadows, Limits to, what is it? Well, anyway, but there's a whole set of critiques surrounding the inability of mass populations to have a perspective on the future. Limits to growth, that's what it is. So there's a whole set of conversations taking both place in Europe and America, and characterized in terms of what I call in the article Habermasian forms of knowledge and human interest. And so among the humanists, among the technocrats, managing different concepts of future, there's this entire discussion about why and how can we get populations to understand the importance of thinking about the future. So that's sort of the framework around which I produce this concept of the graph. And so it's no coincidence that, that when Robert Brain says, hey, look, these scientists were actually, it shifted the concept, Enlightenment concept of a notion of balance to linear temporality through using these graphs. What happens is actually the graphs become imposed upon mass populations so that the graphs themselves serve as a kind of technique for future visualization. And so that's sort of how I'm referring to it. I'm not referring to one particular idea of whether it's an economist's future. It does happen in a particular ethnographic form, right? I talk about restructuring of energy markets in which the introduction of economic graphs supplants regulatory legislative text. So in that context, economic graphing displaces textual regulation. And then in the context of climate change, I talk about the various staging of verification among environmental activists who say, why are we running around creating these dramaturgical forms, jumping off of smokestacks and whatever, when we can actually just throw out a scientific image that holds its own integrity without, having anybody around it or an independent media acting on its own form. So and I should probably make that up front then, because what I'm really concerned with is the fact that these are sets of timelines and concerns that are really specific to a professionalized groups of technocratic and humanistic intellectuals during the 1970s, whose lifestyle becomes imposed, whose aesthetic lifestyle becomes imposed on mass populations through the proliferation of this particular kind of image. And that's why I refer to it as a set of manners. And that's why I say that the paintings and the oil graphs are similar, because it's not really clear to me that this is about energy planning. It could be just simply about, this is how I want to decorate my home. And that's why I also introduced that image at the end by Alexis Rockman, because he's clear. He says, look, why are you guys showing graphs? That's not going to connect with anybody. If we're going to actually have the future make an impression on mass populations in a way that's going to be sort of commensurable with how they feel in life, we've got to depict it in a more anti-Kantian, self-evident perspective.
Yeah, thanks a lot, Arthur. That was interesting.
And it's a good question. It's a great question. I appreciate it.
Okay. My next question is a statement which you have in the abstract and also a couple of times in the chapter, page 3 and 4, where you talk about the graph's substitution or departure from text-based and self-evident visual encounters. And I felt that it could be interesting to go more deeply into this statement. Are you implying that other forms of visual encounter are more self-evident? For example, are maps, photographs, film more self-evident than graphs? Or could you accept they are equally open to manipulation? And secondly, are text-based encounters necessarily less abstract than graphs? Texts are culturally dependent on language, they're dependent on ability to read, ability to understand what is written. So my question here, the second part of the question is, does text resemble the object it is describing more than graphs?
Okay, so I'll answer the second question first. The whole idea of me showing these practices in the museum and the relationship with abstraction is that there was a certain set of practices around delay of understanding the image. Let's face it, it takes 20 years to learn how to read. My students are just now sort of having a familiarity with text. So, as far as text is concerned, no one has thought to say, to think about text in the way that a graph, it takes quite a bit of time. Bourdieu's whole argument is that modern art takes an enormous amount of time to understand as an immediate recognition. That's why I use the stress and achievement or consecration of an effort, right? So text itself, it takes a long time to learn it, right? So that's why I call it as an image. But in specific, going back to your first part of the question, there's this particular point where, for example, especially in regulation or deregulation and restructuring of energy markets, of finance, of air travel, most of those profits, most of those prices, most of that entire universe was created up until the mid-1970s and 80s by lawyers. It was a regulatory world that was constituted through text. And what happens after the deregulatory period in the 1980s is that what we see is an introduction of economics, cost-based and economic cost analysis into government deregulation. And that, with that, introduces the concept of a graph in order to think about how these futures are being constructed. And so that's, in that particular context, I say that the graph displaces text. Text becomes back-ended, and economists and the way in which they depict this is fore-ended. The example I give in my article is Kate Saloom's work on the bond yield. She says pretty clearly in the 1970s, in the New York Times, in The Economist, there were articles introducing the public or introducing financial analysts and instructing them on how to read the bond yield curve. So there's clearly a shift toward a financialization that's depicted in these images that then displaces the regulatory world. So that's sort of how, that's a good point. And I should sort of think about how to make that more concrete, because when I just say text and graph, it sounds like I'm referring to images, but what I'm actually referring to is a displacement of one type of regime of knowledge infrastructure with another.
Okay, yeah, well, thanks. That was a good clarification there. My third question is to do with the assumptions upon which graphs are based. I'm thinking particularly in relation to future studies. I have myself worked with other types of scenario, together with a Swedish colleague. And I would suggest that graphs, like other forms of presentation of potential futures, such as verbal scenarios or pictorial scenarios, depend ultimately on interpretation and the underlying assumptions on which they are based. And often the underlying assumptions are not made explicit. So I'm wondering whether this is the real problem rather than graphs in itself, that the underlying assumptions on which they're based are not made sufficiently explicit, and especially when being presented to a broad mass audience.
That's a great question too, because it has nothing to do with my work. I mean, it comes up in talks on Team Society. I always ask a question like, "What's the assumptions here?" But that has nothing to do with this chapter. I could care less about the assumptions of it. What I'm really talking about is this sort of mass object, this historical object that has a mass underneath it that then appears to us. I don't care what the mass is. In this case, it happens to be economists and it happens to be scientists, climate scientists. Whether it's true or not, that's neither here nor there. But what I do argue is that the graphs do retain, and I argue this in the paper, the Kantian aesthetic, the graph does retain its authenticity as an image to stand alone outside any kind of regime of knowledge. That's how strong it is. Whereas the anti-Kantian aesthetic, things that are self-evident, their truth value has eroded since the 1970s. I put in the article the whole premise of what are these television shows that are based on real time? What are they called? I don't know. I can't. It's
reality shows.
No. It's where they have a camera.
Real-time shows.
Reality shows.
Yeah, reality shows. The whole concept of reality shows is to reintroduce the concept of authenticity into the self-evident image because it's been totally eroded. Nobody believes in self-evident images anymore. You know, it's a category of special effects. Now, that's not exactly the case, right? We were pretty much, you know, on board when we were looking at the invasion of the Capitol a couple of weeks ago. That was an anti-Kantian tornado, you know, and I was looking at it thinking, gosh, you know, what is this chapter in the context of this? But primarily, you know, what I'm talking about is this image that environmental activists use because of its ability to hold on, like an art image, right? Its ability to hold on to its authenticity outside any kind of spokesperson or referential location associated with it.
Yeah, thanks, Arthur. I very much appreciate this historical view of a new type of representation appearing at a particular time in relation to particular concerns and events. As I said, I've worked a little bit with one time with scenarios, and we argued that the point of future studies is, or at least should be, not necessary to say something necessarily definite about an unknowable future, but to say something about the possibilities of changing a trend. We used scenarios using artists' drawings, which in a way, which is of course the Kantian image. And these were based again on clearly formulated written premises. And the whole point was that we presented a series of alternatives, several scenarios. You can't just have one scenario based on differing premises. And it was to do with agricultural policies. And we presented these, we cooperated with economists, and we presented our work to agricultural advisors in the areas that we were studying. And first came the economists, and they showed a series of graphs, and people sort of politely nodded. And then we showed a series of artists' images, which that got people discussing. So in a sense, that really is an example which supports what you're saying. I've just got one final question, and that is, I wonder if you could go a little bit more in depth on the role of colour in relation to graphs. You had these very evocative images of the yellow and blue with the deep sea horizon there. And you do have one or two examples of graphs where the same colours are used. But I wonder if you could go a little bit more elaborate a little bit more on what role colour has in people's perception of graphs or other types of image, particularly artistic images.
I'm not going to be able to, but that's a great question. I'll just say this: there's this sort of yellow and blue emerged as a form in the around 2000, and it was taken up by Hollywood movies. So like movies like The Matrix or Transformers, they obsessed over this kind of yellow and blue seeing in formula, and the idea of a blue background and a yellow human being was able to, the idea was that these humans would pop out of the screen. And so that particular color contrast actually appears a lot in energy images that I sort of introduced this chapter about, which I don't talk about. And I guess the point there is that that there are particular kinds of images in energy, around energy development, that coincide with advertising, for example. You know, as we saw after deregulation, energy becomes no longer a basic necessity, but a commodity. And what best way to sell a commodity than hire an advertising firm? And so you begin to see the types of images that emerge around energy production and sale, and its sale merging with a mature advertising company. Whereas graphs themselves, you know, they were actually, at least in energy development, I sort of trace them back to the 1970s with sort of in the wake of the OPEC the OPEC crisis and the establishment of national energy foundations by government, so to study the future, for example, the Energy Information Administration or the International Energy Agency. And so that's when you actually see that, they're creating graphs and not necessarily thinking about how these pictures are going to resemble outside the. I have a few questions here on here. Thomas, do you want to, Michael,
Yeah.
you or how do you want to?
No, I'm finished. So
Thanks a lot. Those are really good questions, and I really appreciate that. Obviously I'm pretty good at defending my ideas, and that's a little problematic actually, because I don't want to, magnify this concept of an abstract or a Kantian image. My idea was a little bit picaresque or absurdist in a way, to try to rethink, how can we approach or reapproach the concept of change, or reapproach the concept of contestation from, a completely different other perspective. So it was sort of, a provocation in a way, and it's just a chapter in a book, even though, now we're talking like, oh my goodness, Arthur, whoa. But it's this would clarify the connection of abstract art. I'm not clear its relevance in regard to graphs. Are you saying abstract images are bad communication or misrepresentations in the same way as graphs? That's a good question. And, I hesitate to speak about art with Laura here because she's an art historian and she's actually read this and made some pointers. And so there are certain things that I'm not able to do really specifically. I'm not a historian. I'm not an art historian. And so that's a great question, because I am making sort of a weaker link between abstractions, contemporary art, and graphs. But my main point there is to conflate what Bourdieu construes as an unfair class system in which one group of people are educated in a particular way and therefore develop a certain kind of classification system about knowledge. I'm conflating his class system to the representation of knowledge in science and art. So, and it's not even clear, and I say this in the chapter, it's not even clear that, that we're living anymore under this kind of, duality in which that there's, pop art and then there's sort of, high art, that's obviously, to construct society in that way would be a little bit, it's just, we don't just do that anymore. But nevertheless, I guess I retain that, that heuristic device to think through the way in which we receive these images as if they're representations of futures, as if they are representations or the only representations of which we can understand the future. But, in effect, they're basically, created by a group of people whose lives are distanced from basic needs, and it's that kind of aesthetic that is being sort of then presented as a naturalized form for us to then embrace as an understanding of the future.
So we have Hobart with a hand.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Arthur, for your interesting elaboration. It's a very dense and complex argument, so I'm not sure whether I have wrapped my head around the right elements of it. But as I understand it, you talk about these two ways of representing, or these two modes of representing, where one of them is able to survive on its own and the other is more subject to specific interpretations. And then, of course, the democratic element there is that this interpretation might or might not be monopolized by elite groups. And in one of the answers to your question in one of your answers to Michael's question, you said that you don't care very much about the underlying reality, whether it is depicted appropriately or not. I was wondering, I know that in many natural sciences, but also in positivist social sciences, there are mathematical methods, mathematical operations, of which it can be argued that they have no correlate whatsoever in reality. So theoretical physicists, they do their calculations on things that you cannot, that are not in the reality out there. So yeah, I was wondering whether you have thought about that phenomenon, because the things that you have been discussing so far, I think, are largely things that are existing in the reality somewhere out there. Of course, bracketing our own responsibility in interpreting those. But what about things that have no correlate in the world out there, but that are still real knowledge? I mean, mathematics is a very real form of knowledge, even though much of what happens at the Faculty of Mathematics cannot be found in the physical reality that we live in.
I don't know if I'm going to answer your question, but it's triggered a bunch of things that I want to say.
Yeah, okay, please do.
First of all, I have to say that that because this is recorded, or because we're it's not that I don't care about the underlying knowledge. That
no. I mean, I'm the first honest to deny all reality.
Yeah. I mean, I always make these like crazy exaggerations to thinking that that'll help things, and it doesn't. But I need to clarify that. But one of the things that I when you were talking is let's see. So yeah, right. So this is another thing that I don't do in the chapter that I think that I probably should. One of the things that I'm trying to do is to go into a really specific conversation with a dialogue or discussion around representation. Representation is built off of Wittgenstein's concept of family resemblance in philosophical investigations. And that's actually, he's talking about mathematics there. He's talking about numbers, about the way in which, number sets that, how is it that we know a game is a game? And he comes up with this concept of family resemblance. And it can also be seen in Aristotle's ethics about equality of ratios and proportions, right? So there is clearly, an issue of resemblance in mathematics that relates to a concept of, and of course in classical rhetoric too, in Ricoeur's work, which I refer to. But so it's actually, I think your question is really germane, and what I'm trying to do is to try to say, okay, well, how have we thought about representation, and and why is it that we're clinging to these concepts of resemblance in a particular way, and what does it actually mean to have this disjuncture between different kinds of resemblance between sort of between particular images that purport to represent in a way. So it's not a great answer to your question. It's I think what you're raising is really is something that I should look into, because clearly some of the philosophical foundations of the support in the social sciences around the term representation do actually come from philosophy that's grounded in mathematics. So I appreciate that.
Yeah. Okay, thanks.
So you have a question in the chat now, Arthur, from Julia Leda. I don't know if you want to say it, Julia, or if you just want Arthur to read it. And you're both muted.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't gonna say it, but sure. Yeah, I mean, I think representation is really a key concept in what you're arguing, at least based on the presentation. I haven't read the whole chapter, But I was also at different times in your talk thinking about the concept of indexicality and the idea of photography as a true or authentic document of reality because of the fact that the thing in the photograph existed in the real world at that moment, and it made a physical impression on a physical material of film, which was then developed and so on. And this concept obviously is getting a lot of attention and has been since we've been facing digitization and the invention of digital photography and cinema. But it also, I think, raises a lot of questions about abstraction versus authenticity, or abstraction versus representationality, and stuff like that. So not sure if you've already thought about it and dismissed it, or if this could be a useful thing to bring in for you.
Yeah, I have thought about it. So in this, I didn't talk about the book that I'm writing, but the book Energy Image has actually 4 typologies. And one of them is the graph. Another is what I call the polyphonic form. A third is the hedonistic form, which sort of utilizes art. And then the fourth is what I call simulation, which is the photographic form. And that to me is, again, just a representation, you know, and that's why I put it up in one of my slides, the photograph of the oil rig that then becomes used to represent this hedonistic representation of the oil rig in a painted kind of form. But both of them are still resemblance to an actual object. And I guess, you know, it's really interesting that you say that. You know, I don't deal, like I do deal with indexicality, but I'm not sure how to explain this, but I deal with it in terms of corporeal indexicality. So if you saw the first image, for example, you know, there are people who are standing by these graphs. Typically, there's always a person standing by them, and that's what makes them so unusual when they're all of a sudden on their own, floating around, right? But Gore is standing by a graph. The first images I showed, there, you know, there's somebody standing by the graph, and so actually, indexicality comes up as a corporeal form in which the expert sort of gestures to particular forms within the graph or within the image. That's sort of how I'm working with it at this point, because it's, yeah, I don't know if that answers it.
So it is 1 o'clock, so but we have Alexander Dodge's hand. So if it's possible to have both a relatively short question and answer, I know it's a lot to ask, but then we can allow it.
I doubt it, but I mean, this maybe goes a bit beyond Arthur's work, so it's okay if he doesn't want to answer it. But I was thinking, you know, so what Arthur here is introducing the way in which a graph becomes introduced to society in a way, as a form of resemblance. But I guess I would be interested in the question now: what do you do about a society that increasingly expects and requires this form of imagery in order to inspire action? And I'm thinking in the way that in the beginning, or in the wake of the coronavirus pandemic, we had this quite often. We were told about flatten the curve. And showing us this nice graph of what, if we take action now, then we'll be able to flatten the curve and reduce the intensity on hospitals. And it just brings to the attention that we're increasingly needing and requiring this kind of visual imagery in order to inspire to action. And the same with climate change. We can always show pictures to people of droughts, and hurricanes, but we can just as easily show them pictures of snowfalls in London. So the pictures themselves don't inspire that kind of action either, and often pictures can be quite momentary. So yeah, just to put a couple thoughts out there.
Yeah, that's inspiring for my next talk. Addicted to graphs.
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, I mean, it's clear, you know, but I'm glad you bring it up, because basically, you know, one of the questions that needs to be addressed in this chapter is, what's the temporality of this chapter? Like, when, you know, is this, you know, the latest date I refer to it is around, you know, like 2000 with Gore's movie, right? 2006, 2010. You know, maybe I should say that, you know, look, this chapter's, you know, expiration date is 2010, maybe, you know.
Great. So I have a lot of questions, but I will save them for later. And so I really just want to say thanks a lot to Arthur and Michael in particular, and everyone else for coming along. And
thank you, Michael.